third of our bite-sized briefings, which today we're doing across both the children and the adults agenda. And you'll see the rationale for that is, although we're going to share some learning that's specific to adult safeguard and some learning that's specific to children's, the crossover is really quite evident. And you'll hear us talk about some concepts such as intersectionality and other disproportionality and other language phrases that actually are both relevant to adults and children. So we're going to do this once. As I say, we are recording on the basis that we can potentially use this resource and share it with you if you want to take it into Teams afterwards. But we're going to leave some opportunity for questions and reflections at the end. If time runs to plan, so that you can come in and share some feedback. So just in terms of what the aims and the objectives are, so really just an opportunity. It is an hour, so this is not a training event, and I certainly don't want to stand in front of you all online and say that I'm an expert in this. I'm not. What we've done in the business unit is pull research together, and there's quite a lot of national research as well as some local activity we've done, and this is just an opportunity to start to share some of those findings and hear from yourselves in terms of reflection about the impact of that on practice. So the aims for this session is to just give you an opportunity to explore. In particular, we'll talk a lot about race and ethnicity and culture today, but very much the additional protected characteristics and how those things can come together and impact on multi-agency safeguarding practice. Whilst a lot of the learning reviews that we'll share are specific to children and adults that you will support in your day-to-day operations, I did want to just kind of flag at the outset that all of this learning is relevant to you as a workforce. You know, we are a diverse workforce. We have our own race, ethnicity and cultures that we bring into our space. And there is a lot of research now starting to come up in relation to the impact on staff of race and racism, particularly in an adult safeguarding world where you've got dementia patients and those with mental capacity. So it's a lot of resource that we can share outside of this meeting. So an opportunity to consider that. We've also going to look at some of the characteristics of the lives and needs of the children and adults in these reviews that we're drawing from. We want there to be an opportunity to learn and share learning for agencies about how best to respond. That today is not about having all the answers, but it is just about sharing what some of the researchers are putting out there to help you frame your practice. And throughout this, to consider the importance of language, how we discuss these concepts, and ensuring that actually they have meaningful application, both for the children and the adults that you're working with and within the wider workforce. And as I say, finally, there'll be that opportunity for reflection and feedback through ourselves to the partnership, so that you can tell us what support you need as professionals. So that's the aim of this next hour. Just wanted to kind of start really by putting into context why we decided that we would run this event. And as I say, that there is learning across both children's and adults that's starting to emerge both nationally and regionally. From an adult's perspective, there's a really low rate of reporting for discriminatory abuse. Obviously, under the Care Act, there is that category where you might think to go and look for a lot of learning related to the topics that we're discussing today, but is a low rate of reporting. And for Walsall specifically, the data for 2023 to 24, where discriminatory abuse was a risk that was at the end of the year concluded section 42 was 0.73%. So we are talking small numbers at a local level. I think it was the second smallest to modern slavery concluded section 42. So by contrast, within a children's arena, we've seen a significant number of reviews in the last few years, and I've listed a couple there in terms of Child Q, which was back in 2022, where we're starting to see the relevance of race and racism and ethnicity really starting to play out in numbers. Yes, we will share these slides at the end and a number of resources that we'll talk to you about as we go. Sorry, I should have said that at the beginning. So we've got some variability in terms of the prevalence. In terms of learning from SARS, that kind of low reporting rate plays through. the second triennial assessment of safeguarding annual reviews for adults, 2% of SARS featured discriminatory abuse, so the learning was drawn from that. That has increased. In the previous review, there was only 1%. But by contrast, what we do know from national police reporting around offences is that hate crime has been on the increase for the last 7 years, with the exception of 2023. I've got a typo there. So 2023-24, we saw a bit of a dip last year, but prior to that, hate crimes have been increasing year on year. So trying to think about where these the discriminatory abuse and the dynamics around race and racism and those other protected characteristics in the context of hate crime are starting to play out, and where they might be being seen. So if perhaps not in a safeguarding arena, but community safety. A lot of the reviews for adult safeguarding, and I've listed a couple there. So Fiona Pilkington, who people might remember, she was a mother who took the life of herself and her 18-year-old daughter who had learning difficulties after a significant number of years of reporting ASB. I think it was over 10 years worth of harassment that she'd reported. So you can see how some of these things will feature within different arenas and different partnerships like community safety, not just necessarily always through the safeguarding lens. And the other one there was Peter Farquhar. I thought was useful just to kind of flag that one from an adult's perspective, just to bring in some of the discussion we'll have around protected characteristics. Because Peter, he was a retired teacher. Again, this is probably I think about 5-6 years back, his review. He'd formed a relationship with a man through the local church, so he was trying to balance his faith with his sexual identity. And again, even though there wasn't a safeguarding adult review in that case, there was a very high profile review undertaken by the Diocese of Oxford. So we can put all these links into resources if people are interested. But that just shows, I guess, how inclusive culture around LGBTQ and faith comes together in terms of those dynamics that we begin to manage within our day jobs. Peter was defrauded by the male that he thought he was in a relationship with. This male had other relationships with females as well, and sadly, Peter was poisoned by him and he was charged with murder subsequently. So some really significant learning in the context of these protected characteristics and how they play into safeguarding. And then, as I'm sure most people on the call that work within the adult safeguarding arena will be well aware of the Winterbourne View panorama programme that was on, and the case review that came from that in respect of the abuse of residents with learning disabilities. So again, this is not just about families and communities in terms of the safeguarding. This will play out into organisational cultures as well, and we'll talk today about how we within our own service and organisation can address that, as well as obviously look to have our leadership supporting us in our jobs. So a bit of context there. The other review that we'll draw on today from a children's perspective, which again, hopefully people will be familiar with, is the National Panel's briefing that came out earlier this year in relation to race, racism and safeguarding. To say that specifically looks at those three dynamics, but the protected characteristics that we're talking about are still relevant there. And much of the learning, sadly, that report pulls out mirrors what they found in the Victoria Climbay inquiry, which obviously goes back some years now to 2003 and had a significant impact on the child safeguarding structures and systems. So whilst we have made lots of progress over the years, there is still a lot for us to collectively be doing. Just to mention finally, in terms of Walsall, we have done quite recently an audit in relation to equality, diversity and inclusion within the children's arena. And again, just wanted to kind of share some good practice. We audit a very small sample, so 5 children get looked at in the context of our audits here. 2, there was 1 that we didn't grade, 2 were assessed as good, 1 requires improvement. So we are seeing that there's some really good practice evident locally, and where we graded those children's experiences as good, we'd seen that children were at the heart of the decisions, their cultural backgrounds had been respected. That could be from things as simple as access to the religious foods that they would eat, ensuring that religious practices could be adhered to in their placements if they were children in our care, and the use of cultural genograms, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, in helping professionals understand the dynamics of the family background, were also evident. So there is good practice on which we can build at a local level, and that's really what we want to look at today. I have included, I won't go through that slide in detail, but I've just included the recommendations that came from the children's audit, really just to echo how that links with the national learning that we're about to share. So we'll talk in a while about social graces framework and how that can support you in your roles, as well as cultural genograms in terms of just understanding the networks and the cultures that our children and our adults are living within, both in terms of immediate family and wider support networks. There was a recognised need, and this is both local and nationally, about developing understanding around cultural curiosity and cultural competence. That's another phrase that often people use, but really that's about ensuring that within your practice you feel that you have got sufficient skills, knowledge, opportunity for development, so that you are confident in addressing and having conversations about protected characteristics and the impact of those on children's and adults' lives. There is a recognised need for more data. Again, it's local learning, but it's reflective of national findings. So we have some reflective questions at the end of the session, but just thinking about, do you record all of the protected characteristics of the children and the adults that you're working with? Do your systems enable you to do that? Can you have those conversations openly with those that you are supporting? And that's what that kind of fourth recommendation is, asking leaders to consider. So I'm just going to go back to, we'll talk about language as we go through, but just to go back to the title and be really clear what it is. And again, apologies if I am sharing things that some people will be, perceived experts on, because we're trying to make sure that this reaches everybody's needs, and it is a relatively kind of basic information sharing process today. But in terms of equity, equality, diversity and inclusion, we've thought it would be helpful to share this in terms of concepts. I think there's just a nice way of framing that diversity is what this review particularly called the mix. It's what makes us all unique and makes us all special. It's our differences and our similarities, and diversity is what we all bring into our personal life, our work life, our relationships, our interactions on a day-to-day basis. Those things are a given at a personal level, and we can't necessarily always change those in other people, but what we have got within our gift as professionals is to make sure that we include and we are inclusive of that diversity. So again, I thought just nicely framed as making the mix work. So whether or not we are leaders, managers, and we are, challenging ourselves to ensure that diversity is there within our team and we're working to everybody's strengths, or whether that's about being inclusive of your children and adults and wider families and communities. How do we bring people together to feel confident that they can have that sense of belonging? Because from belonging develops trust, and from trust develops that engagement, which we'll go on to talk about in the learning reviews, and the impact of not having that specifically in terms of these adults and children's reviews. So equality, I'm going to just talk very briefly. In fact, I've got a short clip, if it will play, around the Equality Act. And as I say, so law supports, there is a lot of legislation that backs the need for equality, diversity and inclusion in our practice. But equality is the promise, it's what we all have to do. Equity is when we've achieved that and we are able to say to our children and adults, do they feel that they're belonging? Do they feel that they have equal access? Have we broken down some of the structural barriers or the barriers to engagement within our service provision, which again, we're going to go on and talk about. So I thought just a helpful slide to reflect on really what it is that we're specifically talking about. So just to give myself a couple of minutes breather. Kellyanne, can you hear that? Sorry to those if you couldn't hear that. I don't know. I know a couple of people have just put in the chat that they couldn't hear it. We will send out these links. I don't know whether that's perhaps some that are dialing in externally or not. But if you couldn't hear it, oh, thanks, Becky. I was just having a panic. There's just one more clip that I was going to share in a little while. So we will send these out. I thought just a useful reminder in terms of those protected characteristics, because what we're going to talk about is kind of how those protected characteristics can come together and exacerbate some already vulnerabilities and different factors for individuals. So just a useful reminder, I thought, that we looked at those. So we talked about direct and indirect discrimination. Obviously, as I say, the Equality Act and legislation is there. It's taught in the concept there of that video around employer rights, but obviously we all have a direct responsibility to ensure that we are promoting protected characteristics and that we are not inadvertently biased towards those. And that's where some of those hate crime data figures that we shared at the very outset of this session are starting to play out, where people are being targeted because of those protected characteristics. So you can see how these kind of things all come together. Another way of thinking about breaking down diversity when we're talking about it in the concept of our work is that internal diversity. So those things that are unique to us, that we're assigned at birth, or how we choose to identify, versus some of the external diversity experiences, those things that will change dependent on our experience of education, for instance, our choice about how we want to present and appear, our religious beliefs, again, and those family status and relationship status. So a different way perhaps of just thinking about how diversity in its broadest sense can impact, and thought that it was useful that we shared that, because we'll talk about the importance of having these conversations with children and adults and families as we go through the later slides, but they're quite useful headers to think about. How does the organisational diversity, somebody's job, for instance, and their training and status, or financial status, for instance, impact? And these things can be changeable. And then the worldview diversity again, so those political beliefs, and again, more recently, it's been a lot of activity in the press and some of those beliefs becoming more polarised. So there is a need for us as safeguarding services to explore those. So just another way really to think about diversity in its widest sense. So having introduced kind of some of the key concepts, and I'm going to come to a couple more in relation to specific use of language and concepts once we've shared some of this learning. I'm just going to go into now sharing some of the emerging messages from practice, both the adult safeguarding and children's practice. So as I say, this is learning that's come from the review of safeguarding adult reviews and some wider research in the context of safeguarding adult practice around equality, diversity and inclusion. And some of the things that they are kind of prompting us to think about is, how do you identify if a person participating in safeguarding inquiries has got protected characteristics? Some of this goes back to what we said at the very outset about, do your systems, are they enablers? Do they allow you to record those responses that you get from adults? Have you got that confidence to have those conversations? And sometimes things as simple as the knowledge base. So, you know, are you familiar with the 9 protected characteristics that we've just played in that clip? Actively consider that people will have multiple protected characteristics. Now, some of these things sound quite obvious, but these are the findings of case reviews where things have gone wrong or there were opportunities for learning, but they are not always apparent. Some things may very much be visible. But for instance, if you've an older person from a Black or a minority ethnic background who is a gay woman, for instance, will have additional vulnerabilities and challenges in terms of systems and structures that potentially somebody else would not. So it is really important to explore how those protected characteristics come together and impact on those individuals. That is referred to as the intersectional approach, and that's the bit that we're going to just spend a little bit of time focusing on shortly with the other clip, because that is promoted now as a approach to practice that is helpful both within an adult and a children's safeguarding arena, and some of you may well be very familiar with the concept already. So we'll look at that in a bit more detail. Having the importance of having the conversations with individuals is highlighted throughout the learning, both for children and adults. And you know, I think it's important to acknowledge these conversations aren't easy. Lots of reviews highlight the lack of confidence and real concern amongst safeguarding professionals that in having conversations about culture and race and ethnicity, that actually you will be challenged as being racist yourselves, and that then it deters people from having those discussions. So we need to think about what support systems look like within our own organisations to really support practitioners to have those safe conversations and to be encouraged to explore and to challenge where necessary what those perceptions look like in terms of the impact for safeguarding adults and children. And as I say, they are directly related to protected characteristics in terms of adverse experiences. But from the person that you're speaking to, their concept of shame, perhaps some fear around the local community, the stigma that's involved, things as simple as language barriers and access to interpreters. So all those additional factors that sometimes make it far more challenging to have the discussion than might otherwise be the case. So it is important to take an inclusive approach and to think about how discrimination can manifest itself in many different ways, and that can be, I think we had an example earlier from a children's arena about having that opportunity to practice your religious practices within perhaps a care setting. What are the appropriate meals? Have we considered those in terms of those persons' needs based on their ethnicity and religious and cultural practices? So it really does permeate through lots of decision making that you do on a daily basis in terms of safeguarding. Othering attitudes, this was flagged in the Winterbourne case where people saw, again, potentially through fear and anxiety or of being victimised if they stood up and spoke out about what they were seeing, but distancing yourselves from people where you can see that some of those practices are taking place, allowing it therefore to become normalised. And not stepping in, I suppose the bystander effect really, and having those conversations as well through sometimes unwittingly saying things that perhaps are misconstrued, and having those discussions through supervision and your line management structures. So that was flagged as some learning. Okay. And in terms of again, we'll think about this in the context perhaps of antisocial behaviour and some of the other things that play out in reviews. But discrimination and views in terms of societal context. So frequently you'll hear learning about that's what we expect from that community. It's that particular street. Well, that's better than it might be in another household in that street. So some of those biases and assumptions that you see playing out again can impact those with protected characteristics even more significantly. So being mindful to that. And finally, making safeguarding personal. So the framework that's there already in an adult safeguarding context, really, really useful to apply those principles in any safeguarding approaches, and particularly if you're in the children's arena working with the older adolescents and thinking about that kind of person-led approach and really getting them to talk about what life is like for them, what they want, what their wishes and feelings are, and how discrimination is affecting them. And we'll share some ways that you can have those discussions. So that is, they're some of the kind of key emerging concepts from adult safeguarding case reviews. I'm just going to, hopefully this will play, it's just a couple of minutes on this concept of intersectionality, which has come from, I've actually, hopefully if this does work, it's a TED Talks. I'm not sure whether it will. Let's see. Just bear with me while I click past the advert. Can you hear that, Kellyanne?
No, can't hear or see
No.
anything. I think it's you might have to share your other screen that it's gone on to.
Right. I tell you what, just in the interest of time then, hang on. I did think that might not work. Can you just pull that out and get it ready to play, and I'll just carry on talking about the other review, just so I'm not trying to multitask too much. It's the link, but I think I'll need to just play it through a different route, if that'll work, Kellyanne. Thank you. I'm just going to carry on in terms of some of the children's learning. That was just to try to break up my voice for you all. But actually intersectionality is one of the significant points in this review as well, which is why we want to spend a little bit of time just looking at the concept. So I've already talked about the national panel's review that's come out earlier on this year. It's titled It's Silent, Race, Racism and Safeguarding, but it very much echoes a lot of the experiences and learning concepts from those adult reviews that I've just talked about. And the title that they chose was particularly because what they've identified through looking at 40 rapid reviews and a number of local child safeguarding practice reviews is that there is a prevailing silence in terms of talking about race and racism, probably for all of the reasons that we've already explored in terms of the support structures, the knowledge and confidence within organisations to address it, and because often there is just a growing knowledge base now in terms of the actual impact. And we have seen significant progress being made in some contexts. So in particular, you hear in this section about how safeguarding services are responding more effectively to young black boys, for instance, because of a lot of the work that the likes of Carleen Thierman and the contextual safeguarding have done around criminal exploitation over recent years. But what we're also starting to see is then some polarised responses, and we'll talk about that. So there has been a lot of progress, but still what this review found was a significant absence of conversation with individual children about the impact of race, racism and protected characteristics on their life. So this review also identified that whilst reporting around ethnicity has improved, what we weren't able to pick out was those clear lines around other protected characteristics, so the importance of faith for children and their wider families and support structures, how they identify what their gender perceptions and relationships look like to them. So there's very much an underdeveloped understanding of the role and importance of faith and religion. And one of the reflections we've had across the partnership, because we've discussed this reports in some of the subgroups, is about our, as professionals and organisations, how well do we network with the different faith and religious organisations out in our local communities? Do we really draw on them as experts and as places that can support us to engage with some of these children's and families and communities in a way that actually we're making our services accessible to them? So that is one of the reflections we've had, and I'd be keen just to hear what your perspectives on that are, and whether you're familiar with what's out there at the moment in terms of the different localities. Intersectional perspectives. Hopefully, if Kellyanne can make the IT work in a way that I can't, we'll talk to you about that shortly. But again, that very much was prominent in this this report in the context of the impact of how all of these features come together. And just thinking about service engagement and barriers, we've talked about the importance of language barriers, for instance, access to advocacy, or having, gosh, the words completely escape me. I've got my brain's gone, in terms of interpreters, that's the word I'm after. This review found that there was still an over-reliance on family members to become that interpreter for children, and for parents, where services were engaging with parents. Obviously, with that can sometimes be an inherent risk in certain communities where religious beliefs and practices are sometimes, particularly in terms of FGM and other harmful practices, done by elders. And there was also this perception of reference to aunties, for instance, and not being clear whether that is a biological auntie, a family member, or just somebody in that wider child's support structure. So it flagged that while sometimes we as services will say that minority ethnic groups will not engage with us, this report's really encouraging us to look inwards at ourselves and see how it is that we are offering our service. Are we trying to break down some of that stigma that we've already discussed in the earlier slides, and encouraging families to engage and to kind of identify what the barriers look like from their perspective? There is, and this is not unique to this review, but obviously in relation to additional protected characteristics and the impact, there was an absence of children's voices and experiences obvious within the learning reviews that were shared here. We all know that without listening to children's and adults' voices and experience, then our kind of concept of the real risk and what their daily lived experiences look like is going to have gaps in it. In particular, there's an over-reliance in these reviews on looking to family members to speak on behalf of children. That was more acute where potentially we'd got learning difficulties, or children were too young to talk for themselves. There was a more prevalent record of fear amongst children of disclosure, because parents had instructed them not to, and therefore that allowed that parental kind of narrative to dominate. And it was more prevalent in multi-child households, so where we'd seen larger sibling groups, some of the individual children became invisible to services because there perhaps was a focus on just one child amongst that, or the parents' needs to meet that child, so we focused on the parent. So quite a lot of learning in relation to the voice of children. And finally, in terms of community, again, this is probably linked to the concept of language. When we talk about community, sometimes there's a perception that as to what we mean. So most professionals and reviews were talking about community in the geographical concept of where a child or a family lived, and therefore how safe they felt in their local community, how their sense of belonging. But communities can be much more than that, as we all know. It can be membership of social groups. It can be your religious community. You can identify with an ethnic or in terms of sexual identity, and that wasn't explored in its fullest sense. So with the exception of the work around contextual safeguarding, where we have made significant steps over recent years around identifying safe spaces in that geographical kind of concept of a community where children and adults and families can go if they're feeling at risk. What we're not actually seeing is a developed understanding of other communities and membership, which really just feeds into children's and families' broader identities. So there was a real encouragement to explore that. Right, last couple of slides in terms of this, and then we'll just see if we can get to this intersectionality bit. And I think I've probably covered some of these points as we've gone. In terms of the overarching findings, the review found that the understanding of race, ethnicity and culture, whilst being absolutely essential to understanding and really responding effectively to children, still wasn't at its fullest, and that was often to do with the lack of training and awareness and accessibility of development opportunities for professionals. And therefore it remained having an impact on our risk assessment, and obviously then subsequently the response and the support that was being put into these families. I talked about kind of polarization and some of the ways that we are working more effectively to safeguard Black young boys earlier on. So in terms of a lot of the work that in relation to disproportionality and overrepresentation, for instance, within Black young boys in the youth justice system or being criminalised, we are starting to see a kind of sea change nationally, and a lot of national reports now recognising that children are victims, for instance, in exploitation, therefore they shouldn't be perceived as perpetrators. We've got obviously the Baroness Casey review, an audit recently that started to make some national recommendations about turning that on its head. So there is some progress acknowledged in relation to assessing risk towards Black children and supporting them. But what the review did find was that incidents involving Asian children were less likely to consider race and ethnicity. So we've made progress in the context of Black children because of all the research that's been promoted over recent years. But that has actually impacted on Asian children now being overlooked in terms of patterns of abuse and neglect for them and their experiences. So again, just some things to think about how we engage with Asian communities, understand their needs, understand their wishes and their fears about engagement with services, because again, there was a general theme that support was offered, it wasn't accepted, therefore it was a decision that they weren't consenting, and that obviously wasn't explored in the context of race, ethnicity and that sense of trust and belonging. And it plays out, so it's not a bit like the adult data that I shared at the very beginning. If you look at figures around child protection, our Asian children and families are underrepresented both in child protection and within serious safeguarding incident data. So that's probably not a surprising finding, but I just thought that was interesting. And again, the impact of growing up in dual heritage households where perhaps, for instance, you've got mixed Black, Caribbean and white. There was a review example in this report in relation to how the dual heritage within families can impact on children, and again how that can be challenged in terms of fully exploring what that looks like, particularly where parents are separated as well, and whether or not we engage the parents in those conversations. So those were the kind of that's with the salient points in terms of the impact of that learning on practice. I think I've probably covered all of those bits as we've gone through. Adultification, I'm sure many people are aware, that's the concept of how just taking a child's physical appearance, perhaps they look older, particularly adultification of Black boys was linked to the disproportionality examples a few years ago that I was just talking to you about in terms of overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. But linked to that then can often be this over-reliance on parents to protect their children from the perception of unsafe spaces in communities, etc. So a lot of what we've talked about kind of just gets pulled through into this final summary. And again, just to highlight, as was the case with the adult safeguarding learning, the real need for critical challenge, that open reflection and an opportunity for colleagues and peers to sit and reflect on their experiences and how we work with these minority ethnic groups and other children and adults with protected characteristics. So those were the key findings. Before I go on to this, Kellyanne, have you made the magic work? This is a 5-minute clip about intersectionality, and then we're just going to share a couple of frameworks that might help you, and we're at the end then. So I'm just going to play this. Well, Kellyanne will. Thank you.
Can you all see that?
See it? I can't hear it.
No, I haven't pressed play yet. I'm just making sure you can see it.
That's fine. Get ahead of myself. Thank you.
So intersectionality actually came out of my effort to think about how to create a word picture so that people could understand what happens when the kind of inequality that they're prepared to deal with overlaps or has an encounter with the kind of inequality that they're not committed to, haven't even thought about, don't experience it themselves, and don't necessarily feel called upon to be present in that. Intersectionality is also a frame. It's a frame that gives us a greater sense of how certain social problems come about, and importantly, what needs to be rethought in terms of the conventional interventions that we create for those inequalities when those interventions come out of narrow or non-intersectional frames. I came across a case that featured a woman named Emma de Graffenried. She was actually representing an entire group of Black women who were seeking better employment opportunities at an auto manufacturing plant in the Midwest. She was a wife, she was a mom, she was working class, she was really hoping to advance her family's well-being by seeking a different kind of job than the ones that typically were set aside for a woman like her. A job as a domestic worker or a job as a janitorial engineer. These were the kinds of jobs that were underpaid and that were usually without benefits. They weren't the kind of job that would allow you to actually entertain middle class aspirations. So she was trying to get one of those better manufacturing jobs. So she applied for the job, and like other Black women, she was denied. After her denial, she sued the employer, claiming race and gender discrimination. Now, the judge that heard Emma's case dismissed her suit. And he dismissed her suit because the employer in question had, in fact, hired African Americans, and the employer had, in fact, hired women. From the court's vantage point, the fact that they'd hired African Americans and had hired women meant that they did not engage in race discrimination and they didn't engage in gender discrimination. Now, the fact that the African Americans they hired were not women and the women that they hired were not African Americans didn't defeat the argument that these women were unable to prove discrimination because the employer had hired Blacks and had hired women. So from the court's vantage point, the problem was that for Emma to be able to say, I was discriminated against, she had to say, I was discriminated against as a Black person who's a woman. I was discriminated against as a woman who's a Black person. That's what she would have had to say. And the court thought that the law didn't allow her to combine these two causes of action into one. But the fact that no judge ever stopped to think, well, why is this not a symmetrical disability? How come a white class plaintiff can represent all women even though there are differences within them, but a woman of color can't represent everyone, and the same with respect to men. So what we had here was a problem of the belief that women of color were a category in and of themselves. They could not represent themselves on their own, nor could they represent all women or all men. And this is the moment when I really started thinking about pre-existing schemas. You've heard about the story about the father who rushes his son to the hospital who's had an accident. and the surgeon begins to operate and then realizes, oh no, I can't, it's my son. And everyone's stumped by this. How can the father rush him to the hospital, and the surgeon says, he's my son too, until it hits you, duh, the surgeon is a woman. But that it takes that extra moment for it to lock into place. Now just add into that race, class, any other kind of schema that takes even longer for it to lock in, that your pre-existing assumptions about who this person was were all wrong. That's the space for intersectionality.
Thank you, Kellyanne. I think I just need to share my screen again. Okay, so as I say, a concept now, am I back yet? I think so. A concept well rehearsed now in terms of adults and children's safeguarding frameworks and being promoted, certainly from places like LGA, Local Government Association. I've seen some resource in there. Research in Practice has got a lot of resource in relation to intersectionality, but really, in short, just thinking about how those, and I'll just go to this slide first. It's described in other short clips as the kind of intersection in, let's think about Spaghetti Junction in Birmingham, for instance, and how all those roads come together, the different 9 kind of protected characteristics. That woman that was just being discussed would have been right in the centre of that, where all of the traffic is coming and right at you. So one of the concepts around that kind of traffic intersection analogy is just thinking about what are the roads of inequality that somebody is standing on, so exploring that with them, and we've got a couple of ways that you can do that. It talks about, again, in the concept of cars, but thinking about the vehicle of oppression on those roads. So what are those barriers and their impact for this individual? Because once you've done that, then you can start to break those barriers down and address them. And the intersectional approach is about addressing all of those things, because it's the multiple oppression and experience of discrimination for individuals that we are trying to address. And that's where the concept of the social graces model comes in, which again, I know certainly from a Walsall Local Authority Children's Services, there's been some training around social graces. I don't know if other organisations and partners are familiar with that, but this slide, and you'll see it better when you get the slides, the social graces are in these inner circles. But the intersectionality wheel, so they've developed the concept a little bit in terms of the research in practice work to try to think about the experiences of power, privilege and oppression in terms of on those social graces as well. So they've enhanced the model. And again, just a useful, there is tools which we'll send out from the Research in Practice website associated with all of these diagrams. So they're just a useful kind of way to frame a conversation that you're having with older children, families and adults as well in terms of the concepts. So hopefully those things are helpful for you. The other resource that we thought was useful to share, and this had come from the Safeguarding Adults review, was the highlighting the importance of communication skills and starting those conversations. There was a couple of different examples of how you might want to start to explore what the impact of experience was around ethnicity, sexuality, etc., with adults that you're working with and with older children and families. So we've just included, I won't go through them there, but some kind of starter conversations that you can have. That's not to acknowledge that these discussions are very sensitive, they're difficult to talk about, and they are things that we need to be supported with within our organisation, but just thought that they were useful things to share with you. So 10 minutes left, which was kind of where we're aiming for. And I know that's a really quick kind of run through of 2 quite detailed reports, but really just want to give you the opportunity now to have some reflective time to share any feedback that you would like to get back into the partnership in terms of support that you would need, experiences that you've had perhaps that you want to share with us, and we'll take those back. But they're quite small questions on there, but just some questions that we thought might be helpful to just get people thinking about. As a practitioner, do you feel empowered to have the conversations with children, families and adults about their race and identity and those other protected characteristics that we've talked about today? There are some reflective questions for partnership, which again we've taken through our leadership group, so it'd be good to hear from you yourselves. And how confident do you feel to do that in the context of the conversations that we've had today? So I'm just going to pause and see if there's anybody who wants to come in, or use the chat if you don't.